"Stop crying, Zainab," a harsh voice snapped. "You'll wake the neighbors." A woman, tall and stern, stood at the door, her hands on her hips, glaring down at the trembling girl on the floor. Her name was Mrs. Aisha, and she was Zainab's stepmother. There was no love in her eyes, only coldness. Zainab, a young girl of 16, sat huddled in a corner of the small room, her face streaked with tears. I can't do it. I can't." Zainab cried softly, clutching her hands to her chest. "Do you want to starve?" Mrs. Aisha barked. "Then get to work. The kitchen isn't going to clean itself." Zainab wiped her face with the back of her hand and slowly got up. She knew better than to argue. She had learned over the years that to survive in this house, she had to do as she was told. No questions, no complaints. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving her alone in the dark room, her heart heavy with the pain of it all. Zainab's life had never been easy. She was the daughter of a kind woman who had passed away when Zainab was still a child. Her father, a quiet and gentle man, had remarried shortly after her mother's death, thinking that another woman could care for his daughter. That was when Mrs. Aisha came into their lives. At first, things were fine. Mrs. Aisha seemed kind enough, always smiling and saying the right words. But that didn't last long. Soon, Zainab realized that the warmth she had once felt from her father was slowly being replaced by the coldness of her stepmother. It wasn't long before Mrs. Aisha started to treat her differently from her own children, two lazy, spoiled boys who could do no wrong in their mother's eyes. "Zainab, clean the house," Mrs. Aisha would yell. "Sweep the compound, wash the dishes, prepare dinner for us." And when Zainab did all the work, exhausted and hungry, Mrs. Strength, Aisha would tell her that it wasn't enough. She would always find something wrong. If Zainab didn't cook the food perfectly, she would be punished. If the house wasn't spotless, Mrs. Aisha would shout at her until Zainab felt as though she might crumble to dust. Her father, unaware of the cruelty in the house, would simply nod and say, "It's okay, Zainab. Your stepmother is just trying to help." But Zainab knew that no one was helping her. She was trapped in a prison of endless tasks and punishment. One evening, after Zainab had spent hours scrubbing the floors and washing the dishes, Mrs. Aisha came into the kitchen, holding a large basket. "I need you to go to the market," she said, a wicked smile twisting her lips. "The meat vendor has fresh cuts today. I want you to buy some for dinner, and don't dare come back without it." Zainab felt a knot tighten in her stomach. It was already late, and the market would be crowded and dangerous at night. But she didn't dare refuse. "All right, Mama," Zainab said, though the word felt foreign on her lips. Mrs. Aisha was not her mother, but it was a title she was forced to use. As she walked through the streets of Abuja, the city lights shining above her, Zainab thought about the unfairness of it all. She had no freedom, no voice. Every day was the same, endless chores, no love, no comfort. She missed her mother dearly, the gentle woman who had taught her how to laugh and how to dream. As Zainab reached the market, she saw the meat vendor and handed him the money. She was so tired, but she knew she had to keep moving. As she was about to leave, a woman approached her. The woman looked old, with weathered skin and sharp eyes. "You look troubled, child," the woman said, her voice low and kind. "Are you well?" Zainab hesitated. She didn't know this woman, but there was something in her voice that made her want to talk. I don't know," Zainab whispered. "I live with my stepmother. She is so cruel to me. I don't know what to do." The woman studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I see. You have been given a heavy burden, child, but do not worry. You are not alone." Zainab blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" The woman smiled faintly. "There are powers in this world beyond what you see. Sometimes, when someone has suffered enough, they find a way to break free. Listen to your heart, child, and when the time comes, you will know what to do." With those words, the woman disappeared into the crowd, leaving Zainab standing there, uncertain but strangely comforted. The next day, Mrs. Aisha gave Zainab yet another impossible task. "Zainab, go to the river and fetch water. And do it quickly, or I'll make sure your father knows how lazy you've become." In the city of Abuja, where boreholes was everywhere, her Her stepmom prefers to send her to a stream in the outskirt of Abuja. Zainab took the large pot and trudged toward the river, her steps heavy with dread. As she reached the water's edge, she heard something strange. A faint whisper in the wind. It was the same voice she had heard from the woman in the market. "Do not fear, Zainab, your time is near." Zainab froze, looking around, but saw no one. The river was still. The only sound was the gentle flow of water. "I don't understand," she whispered to the wind. "What do I do?" But no answer came, only the soft rustle of leaves. Zainab filled the pot with water, but something inside her had changed. There was a new spark of hope, a small, flickering light that told her she wasn't truly alone. The days passed, and Zainab continued to obey Mrs. Aisha's cruel commands. But now, in the quiet moments between the chores, she could feel something stirring inside her. She was tired of being weak, tired of being mistreated. She wanted to break free, to escape the nightmare that had become her life. One evening, as Zainab prepared dinner, Mrs. Aisha came into the kitchen with a wicked gleam in her eyes. "Tonight," she said, "you will work harder than ever. I expect everything to be perfect." Zainab's heart pounded, but this time, she didn't tremble. "I won't do it," she said quietly, her voice strong. "I won't let you treat me this way anymore." Mrs. Aisha's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" "I said," Zainab repeated, louder now, "I won't do it." For the first time, she felt the power of her own words. Mrs. Aisha stared at her, eyes wide in shock. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension. "What are you going to do about it?" Mrs. Aisha sneered, taking a step closer. "You think you can stand up to me?" Zainab swallowed, her heart racing. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she could not back down. Zainab stood firm, her hands clenched at her sides. She could feel her heart thudding loudly in her chest, but the anger that had been quietly growing inside her finally bubbled to the surface. For so long, she had been forced into silence, forced to obey without question, but tonight something inside her refused to stay quiet. Mrs. Aisha's eyes flashed with fury. "You ungrateful girl, how dare you speak to me like that?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the silence of the room. "I'll make sure you regret this." But Zainab didn't back down. "I've had enough, Auntie. You can no longer treat me like this." Her voice was low but steady, the words flowing from her lips without fear. It felt strange, like someone else was speaking through her, someone stronger than the helpless girl she had been. Mrs. Aisha's face twisted with disbelief, and for a moment Zainab thought she might lash out. But then something in the air changed. It wasn't just the anger in Mrs. Aisha's eyes, it was something darker. The room grew colder, and Zainab felt a shiver run down her spine. She could almost feel a weight pressing against her chest, as if an invisible force was closing in around her. "Do you think you can defy me?" Mrs. Aisha sneered, her voice now dangerously low. "You have no idea what I am capable of." Zainab's heart pounded. This was no ordinary woman standing in front of her. There was something strange about Mrs. Aisha, something Zainab had never noticed before. And in that moment, a memory flashed in her mind. The woman in the market, the one who had spoken to her about powers and freedom. "Don't be afraid, child," the old woman's voice echoed in her mind. "You have the strength within you. But remember, every choice has a price." Zainab felt a wave of determination wash over her. She didn't know what she was about to do, but she knew she couldn't let this continue. She stepped forward, her gaze locking with Mrs. Aisha's. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Zainab said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I don't care what you are. I won't let you hurt me or my father." For a long moment, there was silence. Mrs. Aisha's expression flickered between rage and something else, something dark. Then, with a sudden motion, she reached for Zainab's arm. Her fingers like claws, but just as her hand was about to grab hold, the air in the room shifted, and a sudden gust of wind blew through the window, knocking over a jar of flour. Mrs. Aisha stumbled back, her eyes wide with shock. "What? What was that?" she gasped. Zainab didn't wait for her to recover. She turned and ran out of the room, her heart racing. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she couldn't stay there any longer. She dashed through the narrow hallways of the house, her feet pounding against the cold floor. As she reached the front door, she paused for just a moment, glancing back over her shoulder. Mrs. Aisha was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, staring after her with an expression of utter disbelief, her lips trembling with anger. Without looking back, Zainab threw open the door and rushed outside into the night. The streets of Abuja were quiet, the city lights casting long shadows over the pavement. Zainab ran, not knowing where she was going, but feeling an overwhelming need to escape. As she ran through the darkened streets, the wind seemed to pick up again, swirling around her as if guiding her. Her feet carried her all the way to the riverbank, the same place where she had fetched water that day. The moon shone brightly above, casting a silver glow on the water below. Zainab stood still, breathing heavily, her heart still pounding from the fear and adrenaline. She heard the same whisper again, soft and distant, but clear. "You are not alone, Zainab." Zainab's head whipped around, her eyes searching for the source of the voice. She had no idea where it was coming from, but she felt an eerie sense of comfort, as if something, or someone, was watching over her. "You are stronger than you know. Trust in yourself, child. The time for your freedom is now." Zainab closed her eyes, breathing deeply. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew that the choice she had made, standing up to Mrs. Aisha, was only the beginning. Something was stirring inside her, something powerful, and it was beginning to awaken. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind her. Zainab spun around to see a figure approaching. It was a man, tall and cloaked in a dark robe. His face was hidden in shadow, but his presence was unmistakable. Zainab's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The man stopped just a few feet away from her, his eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. He spoke softly, his voice deep and soothing. "I am here to guide you, Zainab. You have already begun to unlock the power within you. The choice you made tonight has set things in motion, but the path ahead will not be easy. There are forces far greater than you know, and you will face challenges that will test your strength." Zainab stepped back, confusion clouding her mind. "What do you mean? I don't understand." The man smiled gently. "You have the power to break free from your stepmother's grip, to free yourself from her cruelty. But you must learn to control that power, to use it wisely. And to do that, you will need help." Zainab felt a chill run through her body. Help from who? The man extended his hand toward her, his voice firm. "From the ones who have walked this path before you. You will find them when the time is right. But for now, you must return home. The journey will not wait." Zainab hesitated. She didn't want to go back to the house, to face Mrs. Aisha again. But the man's presence was calming, and his words filled her with a sense of purpose. She knew that her life was about to change forever, but the road ahead would be dangerous. She had to be ready. "I'll go," Zainab said, her voice steady now, "but I need to understand more. I need to know what to do." The man nodded. "Patience, Zainab. All in good time. For now, return home. But remember this, your power lies not in the magic of the world, but in your own heart." Zainab turned and walked back toward the city, the weight of his words heavy on her mind. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but she knew that she wasn't alone anymore. And that was enough. Zainab's feet seemed to carry her back home without thinking. The cool night air kissed her skin as she walked, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Who was the man by the river? What power did he mean? And how had she, a simple girl from a small home, found the strength to stand up to her cruel stepmother? As the city lights grew brighter in the distance, the familiar sounds of Abuja filled her ears. The distant honking of cars, the chatter of night market vendors, the occasional bark of a dog. But none of it felt the same. Zainab felt as though something inside her had changed. She was no longer the same timid girl who had silently obeyed Mrs. Aisha's every command. She arrived back at the house, the door creaking open under her touch. The silence of the house greeted her, oppressive and thick. She hesitated for a moment, standing in the dark entryway, her breath shallow. She knew she couldn't avoid Mrs. Aisha forever. The woman would be waiting, plotting her next cruel task, and Zainab wasn't sure how to face her. But then, remembering the man's words by the river, a new resolve filled her heart. Your power lies not in the magic of the world, but in your own heart. Zainab took a deep breath and stepped forward. She wasn't going to let fear rule her anymore. She was going to stand her ground. As she entered the living room, she saw Mrs. Aisha sitting in the corner, a dark frown on her face as she idly combed her hair. The moment she saw Zainab, her eyes flashed with irritation. "Well, look who finally decided to come back," Mrs. Aisha sneered. "I hope you brought the meat from the market. If you didn't—" "I didn't go to the market, Auntie," Zainab interrupted, surprising herself with the strength of her voice. "I went to the river. I needed some time to think." Mrs. Aisha's eyes narrowed. "You disobeyed me? You were supposed to get meat for the family, not wander off like a fool." Zainab stood tall, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "I'm not a fool, and I'm done being treated like one. I've had enough, Auntie." The stepmother froze, her comb pausing in midair. There was a long, heavy silence before Mrs. Aisha finally spoke, her voice cold and venomous. "Enough? You've had enough? Do you think I care about your little tantrums? You are nothing but a servant in this house, Zainab. You will do as I say, or else." "Or else what?" Zainab asked, her hands trembling but her legs firm beneath her. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." Mrs. Aisha stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She took a step toward Zainab, but there was a dangerous gleam in her eyes. "You don't know what you're dealing with, girl. You're playing with forces you can't control." "I'm not playing, Auntie. I'm finally standing up to you," Zainab said, her voice growing stronger. "And I don't care what happens anymore. I will no longer let you treat me like this." Mrs. Aisha's lips curled into a malicious grin. "So be it then. You want to defy me? You think you have power? Let's see how long your defiance lasts." Before Zainab could react, Mrs. Aisha raised her hand, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if something dark and heavy had entered the space. Zainab's chest tightened, and she felt a sharp, cold wave of fear wash over her. She backed away instinctively, but Mrs. Aisha's voice cut through the air like a blade. "I've warned you, Zainab. Now you'll pay the price." The room seemed to pulse with an energy that Zainab had never felt before. She could feel something dark and dangerous beginning to swirl in the space between them, and for a moment, it seemed like the shadows themselves were closing in on her. But then, in the depths of her fear, Zainab remembered the man by the river and his words. "Your power lies not in the magic of the world, but in your own heart." "My heart," Zainab whispered, her voice shaking but determined. "My heart." In that instant, something inside her stirred, a warmth that began to spread from her chest, growing with each beat of her heart. It was a strength she hadn't known she had, a power born not of magic, but of her own will. The shadows that had seemed to close in around her began to pull back, as though repelled by an invisible force. Mrs. Aisha's eyes widened in shock. "What is this? What are you doing?" she hissed, taking a step back. Zainab could feel it now, a calm power coursing through her veins. She wasn't just standing up to her stepmother, she was fighting back, and she could feel every ounce of her strength flowing into her. "I'm done, Auntie," Zainab said, her voice stronger than ever. "You can't control me anymore." With a sharp wave of her hand, Mrs. Aisha tried to push the darkness toward Zainab again. But this time, Zainab raised her hand in response. To her surprise, the shadows froze in midair, as if blocked by an invisible barrier. What is this?" Mrs. Aisha stammered, fear creeping into her voice for the first time. Zainab stepped forward slowly, her gaze unflinching. "This is me standing up for myself, Auntie, and I don't think you can stop me anymore." In a burst of energy that she didn't fully understand, the darkness that Mrs. Aisha had summoned seemed to crumble away, disappearing into the air like smoke. The room felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifting. Mrs. Aisha stumbled back, staring at Zainab with wide, shocked eyes. "No, this can't be, you're just a girl." Zainab's chest heaved with the power of what she had just done. It felt like something inside her had finally unlocked, a part of herself that she never knew existed. She wasn't just a girl anymore. She was strong, she was capable, and she was no longer afraid. "You're right," Zainab said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm just a girl, but I'm no longer your servant." Mrs. Aisha took another step back, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and rage. "You'll regret this, Zainab. I'll make sure you regret this." Zainab didn't flinch. "No, Auntie, you will regret ever thinking you could control me." The room was silent for a moment as both of them stood there, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Then, with a final sneer, Mrs. Aisha turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Zainab stood alone, her heart racing with adrenaline, but also with a sense of peace she had never known. "It's over," she thought, her breath slow and steady now. "I'm free." But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning.